sent him years ago, but it's not really what makes him very interesting to me. But what makes him most interesting is his writings and his criticisms of American life and culture in the late 19th and late 20th centuries. So I think we typically approach the Adamses through politics, but I really approach Henry Adams through his writings and through his cultural lens. And so let me just say a few things by way of introduction, what he's done and what he's written. So here's a big book, and this is the Library of America. It's a tremendous book series. It started in the 1980s, and they publish sort of the great American canon. So Twain, Philip Roth, Shirley Jackson. I think they're on Wendell Berry now. And these are the canon keepers. This is what's supposed to be so, vital, living, and persistent in American letters. What I find interesting about this is that Henry Adams, I think, has perhaps more representation in this series than anybody. More than Hemingway, more than Edith Wharton, more than Benjamin Franklin. Because what I find here is that Henry Adams's histories are in this series. His novels, he wrote 2 novels, they're in this series. I find that his poem, on Brahma and Buddha, is in this series. I find that his memoir, The Education of Henry Adams, is in this series. In other words, the Library of America, they say, what is vital, what should be preserved in terms of literary culture in America? In at least 4 distinct genres, Henry Adams has his place there. So you might know something about Henry Adams, and that is he liked to, in a tongue-in-cheek way, declare himself to be a failure because, unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, he was not president. He was just not going to be president of the United States in the late 19th century. He was tongue-in-cheek. He really meant that that was America's failure for not appreciating him, not appreciating the persistence of the Adams family in an industrial civilization. One might say that he was actually more fortunate not to be in politics in the late 19th century. If you look at who the chief executives were, they weren't necessarily august or distinguished. Few people today remember Rutherford B. Hayes or Chet Arthur, but they do remember, they do turn back to some of the great cultural criticism that was put out by scholars, theoreticians, philosophers, and writers like Henry Adams. And so, in certain respects, I think he was very fortunate not to fall into the snare, the trap of Gilded Age politics, but instead, he really was a critical thinker who was able to tell us so much about American life, culture, industrialization, where we had been and where we might be going. Let me say one other thing at this point, and that is his most famous work is probably The Education of Henry Adams. This was written between 1905 and 1907, and it was published upon his death in 1918. And then the following year, 1919, it won the Pulitzer Prize. So it's a work that has a long view and reflects upon not just the history of the United States, not just the history of Henry Adams, it is a memoir in a sense, but upon the history of the modern world since the pace of capitalism and industrialization has become prominent in our culture and our civilization. So that's a little bit about Henry Adams. He was a 3rd son, and he felt fortunate to be a 3rd son because he was not named after his father or grandfather, as his 2 older brothers were. They were laden down with family history. When he decided that he would not be in politics, that he would be an intellectual, the 3rd son thing became a way for him to assert himself and, in a quiet sense, but a strong sense, indicate that he did not have to follow the family path. Because, as he put it, I'm only a 3rd son. And the first 2 sons, they're the ones who have to sort of pick up the family yoke and go to work there. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time looking at various aspects of Adams's life. And what I want to do is use epigraphs, quotations from Adams and from others to go ahead and do that. So here's the first one, okay? And this is Henry Adams writing about himself in The Education of Henry Adams. For some remote reason, he was born an 18th century child. So in a literal sense, this isn't correct. Henry Adams was born in 1838. So he was a 19th century child. But in the sense that Henry Adams meant it, he was an 18th century child. What he means there is that he resonated to, personally, a period of colonialism, a period of pre-industrialization, and he was telling us that he did not really see himself as a child of the Industrial Revolution, okay? And so he's playing around with centuries, he's playing around with history, and with this notion of duality, right? What separates the 18th century from the 19th century. Now, there are lots of people who feel this way. Some people say, I really wasn't made for the 21st century. I was a discoverer. I should have been a 15th century voyager, something to that extent. That's kind of where Henry was coming from here. On this notion of duality, though, it plays in some interesting respects. If you're familiar with The Education, you might know that he absolutely lauds Quincy. He holds Quincy up high. Quincy was the place that his Adams side was from. And he coveted that, not because they were famous, but because of Quincy. The other side of the family, his mother's side, that was the Brooks family. And that's where the money came from. And the Brooks to Henry embodied Boston. And so right away, you've got this interesting duality. For Henry, Quincy is summertime. He's not in school. Quincy is the fruit garden at his grandparents' house. Quincy is sort of lazing around and reading historical novels in his grandparents' barn. By contrast, Boston is where he spent the winter. Boston was where he went to school. Boston was the whole complex of, as he would later see it, financial, urban civilization kind of pinching up against this boyish Henry Adams. So Quincy is wildness, it's playfulness, and it is the 18th century. And Boston is more constricted. Boston is more cerebral, less spontaneous. Therefore, it is the 19th century. Quincy is, in his fantasy, agrarian, and Boston is woefully industrial. Quincy, in his fantasy, is quasi-medieval, and Boston is all too modern. And so this notion about being an 18th century child is Henry's way of cataloging historical time. It is his way of putting himself into the historical process. So Henry doesn't just record history, he's not just a historian, but he very much thinks of himself as a player in the process of time and modernity. So here's another quote. And this is Henry getting ready to leave Boston as a not quite so young man. He and his wife are going to move to Washington, D.C. So here's a little more context. Henry Adams taught at Harvard for 7 years. He didn't want to. He was invited to teach medieval history there, and he refused. And he didn't tell anybody about this refusal, but his family had very close ties to Harvard. In fact, his father had been an overseer at the institution and had been invited to be the president of the school, but turned that down. So for his own reasons, including a little bit of embarrassment because he felt that the family had pulled some strings, Henry was really not that interested in being a professor. When the family learned what had happened, then they began to apply pressure on him, the brothers and the father in particular. So Henry agreed to be a professor at Harvard. A few years into his reign there, he met Marion Hooper, also known as Clover, and they married. They had a 13-year marriage. Early in that marriage, Henry and Clover determined that they were going to leave Boston and they were going to set up shop in Washington, D.C. So here's the quotation from Henry. He's writing to a friend in England. He's explaining what's going to go on here. As for me and my wife, we have made a great leap in the world, cut loose at once from all that has occupied us here in Boston. The fact is, I gravitate to a capital by a primary law of nature. This is the only place in America where society amuses me, or where life offers variety. Henry wrote this in 1877, so he was 5 years into his marriage. What I find very interesting about this is that while so many people, they think of Harvard, and they think of Boston as being these very fecund and pregnant places where there's this dynamic intellectual life, and certainly there's truth to that, but not for Henry Adams. Henry Adams, when he was at Harvard, was also an editor of a prestigious journal, but he really wasn't, up to that point in time, much of a published writer. And yet, when he goes to Washington, D.C., he becomes this tremendous writer. He writes a couple of novels. He writes a 9-volume history of the United States of America in the early Republic. And he really takes off as an intellectual. It seems clear that he was constricted in Cambridge, in Boston, and we know from his letters that when he was reflecting upon his teaching and his days at Harvard, he was concerned that he was simply going to grow old and stale, standing in front of 19-year-olds offering recitation. He did not find that appealing at all. So he makes this great move. He and his wife, they decide that they're going to throw up family. Her father, her mother was gone by this time. Her father was still in the Boston area, and they were going to leave all that behind, and they were going to go to Washington, D.C. So one could ask, in a sense, how new was this for Henry Adams? Because obviously, for many of Americans, they would associate Washington, D.C. with being kind of an Adams city, because that's where you had 2 Adams presidents. That's where, after his own presidency, John Quincy Adams returned as a congressman. But the Adamses had always had a testy relationship with the capital city, never considered it to be, sort of a home. Certainly, John Adams and John Quincy were only too happy after their own presidencies to live primarily back in Quincy. But Henry was attracted to the cosmopolitanism of Washington, D.C. It didn't have a large industrial base. It wasn't like New York. It wasn't the financial capital of the country. But Henry was attracted to the diversity, the human diversity that he found in this capital city. He said, I can't find it anyplace else. It was a tremendous milieu. So Adams made friends with diplomats. He made friends with Northern and Southern congressmen, Westerners, and he was very interested in the human dimension of the capital. Also, for someone who was writing a 9-volume history of the early Republic, Washington, D.C. had some tremendous archives for that kind of scholarship and study. So this is where he sets up shop. He and Clover, they have a famous salon, very small. It was known as the Five of Hearts. It was Henry and Clover and John Hay. John Hay had been Abraham Lincoln's private secretary, and then became very good friends with Henry Adams. And Hay would later become US ambassador to the court of St. James's in London, and then American Secretary of State. The Adams-Hay relationship was so close that they bought plots across the street from Lafayette Park and threw up two impressive homes. They lived, side by side. Unfortunately, those homes were destroyed in 1927, and that is the current location of the Hay Adams Hotel, posh place in Washington, D.C. So it was John Hay and his wife, and then there was Clarence King, who was a New Englander who knew quite a bit about art, and he was also probably most famous for his mountaineering and writing a book about his mountaineering. And so these five, they constituted an interesting clique in Washington, and they called it the Five of Hearts. And this salon was known for its conversation. It was known for its wit. It was also known for its snobbishness. And it was a luxury. It could be a pleasure to be invited. From the testimony that we have from some of those late 19th century Washingtonians, they talk about this salon being the place where you could learn about music, new books, trends in Europe, and it was just a very exciting and intellectually dynamic place to be, which is really what Henry was going for. And so there aren't that many photographs of Henry Adams, and of course they tend to be these kind of dour black and white images of him. But he was very much a social creature, and he very much liked the conversation of others. He wrote to many people, kept up a spirited correspondence. As he aged, he was still able to connect with young people, had lots of nieces, his real nieces, and then what he liked to call nieces and nephews in wish. That is, those younger people who he seemed to get along with, and they seemed to get along with him, and would come to his place and talk and chat and have a little bit of a gathering. So Washington represented all this to Henry Adams, and it was really the place that he was able to take off as an intellectual. It wasn't Cambridge, it wasn't Harvard. For him, it was Washington, D.C. So I've mentioned this 9-volume history. I want to say a little bit more about it. And by way of doing that, here's a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. So you might know that Oliver Wendell Holmes was a member of the Supreme Court from 1902 to I think about 1932. He comes from an old Boston Brahmin family. His father was a surgeon, but maybe more known as a poet, a New England poet. So the roots here are quite deep. And because he was on the Supreme Court, Holmes was living in Washington. And so he had a chance to connect with his fellow Bostonian, Henry Adams. And so this is what Holmes wrote about Adams's history. I think I'm on the whole the first of the Americans who wrote specifically American history. His book is the wrath and insight of a man who did not merely write from documents, but had something of his own to say. I like that because it speaks to the originality of Henry's history. Again, 9 volumes covering the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Originally, Henry thought he would write 2, maybe 3 volumes, but he was conducting research in Europe. And in Europe, he was a bit of an aristocrat because he was an Adams. And so many of these European archives had connections to royal families and the governments of their own country. And they recognized the Adamses, that name. It was a magic name. And so many Adamses had been ambassadors, whether it was in Russia, the Netherlands, Germany, Prussia, I should say, and of course, England, that Henry was able to get access to archival materials that historians hadn't had access to before. And so what was going to be this 2 or 3 volume, pretty much an American story, it really grew in dimension and in length to encompass really the entirety of the Atlantic world in the age of revolutions. So it's framed around Jefferson, and Madison. But really, what we get is the age of Napoleon, the age of revolutions, and how the United States factors in there. So I think one of the reasons why Holmes calls this an original history, Henry had something of his own to say here, was because up to this time, American history had been somewhat formulaic. In other words, there was a mechanical theme that was involved here. And the mechanical theme is that America was about progress, that America was just sort of getting, better and better and better. Sometimes we call this romantic history or Whig history, the notion of progress. And it leaves some things out of history. For example, it leaves tragedy out of history. It leaves detours out of history because it sort of projects this notion that, history is this upward ascent. It's getting more and more positive. And in the United States, there were a couple of scholars, Francis Parkman and George Bancroft, who were probably most connected with the Romantic school, looking at, for example, colonization, the pioneers, the American Revolution, and how the United States was destined to be this great nation, sort of reading the present or wishes for the present back into the past. But Henry didn't do that. Henry really was not engaged in hero worship. He, in fact, was more attracted to the notion of history being kind of a science that was not controlled by people. In other words, we weren't really making our own history. We were really, kind of the playthings to advances in science or technology. And it was just sort of a myth that we actually controlled these things. Henry thinks that technology really controls us. And over the years, this will become an increasingly pronounced feature of his historical outlook. And by the time that he writes The Education, it'll be there really from cover to cover, easy to read in. So for Henry, the big deal in American history, in the Republic, it wasn't Thomas Jefferson or it wasn't James Madison. He wrote that these were figures who actually had very little to say or do in what America was becoming. Okay, that's an idea, that's an argument, but how do you demonstrate that, And what Henry did was he made a counter argument. He said, for him, the biggest thing that happened in America in the early Republic was the invention of the steamboat. So it was that day, that summer day in 1807, when Robert Fulton got on his steamboat and it went up the Hudson River, to Albany. That is, it defied nature. It went against the current. And Henry said that this is the beginning, or at least a very important part of the process of where we're at now. And by now, he was writing in the late 19th century. And this is an age of rampant American industrialization, the Gilded Age, the robber barons, the beginning of what will become, skyscrapers in some of the major cities. And Henry says, Thomas Jefferson, he's interesting, but what does this agrarian slaveholder, who really was 18th century, what does he have to tell us about American life in the late 19th century? And Henry thought very little. And he thought that it was actually Fulton, the inventor, who had something far grander to say. I will mention that people, these days, they do write biographies of men like Fulton, Edison, and other inventors, and people like Walt Disney. And they make the argument as well that, it really wasn't about Harry Truman or Eisenhower or whoever was present at that time, but that in fact, it was the inventors of tomorrow. So here's another quote. And to set this up, Henry Adams, he's writing to Elizabeth Cameron. So Elizabeth Cameron is the most important person in Henry's life after the death of his wife. In 1885, his wife Clover, she took her life. And it was something that, in some respects, I think Henry never got over. He never remarried. I don't think he ever thought about remarrying. He was only in his 40s when his wife died. And he was very conscious and selective about how he thought about and how he sort of projected himself as a widower. For the most part, he would not mention his wife. And so that meant, of course, that others would mention her as well. Yet he did have a largely epistolary relationship, a writing relationship with Elizabeth Cameron. So she was a bit younger than he was. They met because she was married to Donald Cameron, U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. And she and Henry were living at Lafayette Square about the same time. And they grew to be close. And this is about a 4-year relationship. It begins in the 1880s and it ends only with Henry's death. Henry probably would have been interested in a closer relationship, but it's not clear how close. She was a married woman, and Henry Adams was, in many respects, a proper Brahmin, a proper Victorian, and did not want to ensnare himself or someone he cared about in any type of extra marital situation. He would loathe if people had gossiped about him. So Elizabeth Cameron, she comes from Ohio, and she is of the Sherman family. And so one of her uncles is William Tecumseh Sherman, and another uncle is John Sherman, who's a senator and later Secretary of State. Her own father was a judge. And when she was pretty young, she got married to Donald Cameron, who I think was in his early 40s at that point. Cameron had his own family. His wife died, and he had several children, and married Lizzie. And the relationship was not good. Actually, it was a pretty difficult relationship. And I think that Henry Adams meant quite a lot to her. She meant something great to him, but I think it was reciprocal. And we know this because there are lots of letters. And I think that this is one of the great things about the relationship between the two. So here's a very short quip here. Henry is writing to Lizzie, "If you should go back on me, I should wholly disappear." And this is revealing. It's not often that Henry will expose his heart. We don't necessarily expect it in his published writing because thousands of people can be reading that. But this is a man who wrote tons and tons and tons of letters. And depending upon who the person is, he'd be a little bit more candid, a little bit more open. With Lizzie, he's very candid and he's very open. So I think one of the tremendous things about this relationship, and if one is working on Henry Adams, if one is writing a biography of Henry Adams, one wants to come close to the inner man if one can. And one simply can't do that adequately if all one has are the published writings they left us with. And so these letters, and particularly these letters to Lizzie Cameron, they are very instructive. They're very open. And they tell us some very interesting things about Henry Adams. And so for example, this proper Victorian, who had a proper Victorian face to his friends, were very surprised when, after he had completed his long history, he and a colleague, they traveled around the world. And they stopped off principally in Polynesia, Tahiti, in Samoa, and Fiji. And it was in Samoa that Henry Adams encountered the Siva, which is this dance by Samoan women. It would have been, for Henry, a very erotic experience. And he wrote about this. He didn't write about it to most of his friends, but he wrote about it to Lizzie Cameron. And some of his reflections on the Samoa Siva, they got out while he was still overseas. And one of the recipients was the novelist Henry James. Henry had been very good friends with Clover. And through Clover, Henry came to know and become good friends with Henry James. Such good friends that a number of years ago, Louisiana State University Press, they put out a volume just of Henry Adams's letters to Henry James. Good stuff there. And so we've got this great novelist, James, and he's reading Henry's reflections. And he had known Henry for years, but he'd never seen that part of Henry Adams expressed before. And so what James writes is, what a power of bearing oneself, hitherto unsuspected in Henry Adams. And so for me, one of the great things about these letters is that it gives us a side of Henry Adams that we normally wouldn't have. And again, to a biographer, I think to readers as well, that's a tremendous resource. It's a great gift. So I mentioned Henry Adams's writing career, and I mentioned his wife, Clover Adams. One thing I do want to mention here is that Clover herself came from a distinguished family, and this perhaps was part of the problem. Problem in that there was some mental illness there. Her sister took her life. Her aunt took her life. Marrying into the Adams family, in which there was undoubtedly a lot of pressure. That might not have been the best thing, for Clover's health. And she came from a writer's family, but a writer's family much different than the Adamses. The Adamses were known before Henry for state papers, politics, for keeping diaries and daybooks. And the Adams had made an industry of this. It wasn't just that they wrote this stuff, but then when they passed on, later generations would put it together and have it published. And so when Henry was in his early teens, for example, he worked with his father to put together a massive set of his grandfather, John Quincy Adams's papers, all to be published and suitably available in libraries for Americans to be edified for. On Clover's side, however, her mother was a transcendentalist, and she was a poet. And Henry was very aware of this and not a little self-conscious about this as well. So he wrote once that, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, that his wife's family would look down upon the Adamses because the Adamses were dry as dust. They were a mere political family, and they had no sense for the finer literary qualities of life. If you want to read Clover's mother, her poetry, you might have the resource on your bookshelves right now, because Henry David Thoreau, in Walden, which he published in 1854, he quotes from Clover's mother. Henry himself had no great affection for the Transcendentalists. When he was at Harvard, he wrote a review of a book that had just come out on Transcendentalism, and he kind of poked fun at it. He thought it was airy and metaphysical, and just a bunch of air castles. And so, in that sense, it might suggest to us that the marriage also was perhaps in a little bit of trouble, in that the families came from really distinctly different places. Let me read something from the history. This is at the very end. And so we began in 1800, we're now up to 1817. The United States has recently, with the War of 1812, been invaded. Its capital has been burned, and yet it is, if not exactly defeated Great Britain, it has outlasted Great Britain. It has survived a second war in 2 generations with the greatest military power in the world. And it has a steam engine. The technology is now therefore to grow. And so Henry is reflecting on the year 1817 and what it means to America. Just listen to the language here, because there's a little bit of play between the old history, which is the romantic history, and the new history, which is supposedly the scientific history that Henry was able to pick up as a professional historian at Harvard. Henry writes, "A vast amount of conservatism still lingered among the people in the country, but the future spirit of society could hardly fail to be intelligent, rapid movement, and mild in method. The inertia of several 100 million people, all formed in a similar social mold, was as likely to stifle energy as to stimulate evolution." Henry wants to eat his cake and have it here. He wants to, in a sense, tip his cap to the romantic historiography. He doesn't want to write a mere history. He wants to write an epic, 9 volumes. And also, from the quote, right, he refers to the spirit of society. Well, how do you quantify the spirit of society? That is a, that's a romantic supposition. But then he comes back, in the last line there, he refers to as likely to stifle energy as to stimulate evolution. And so he's referring to scientific history, evolution. Darwin writes The Origin of Species, it's published in 1859, and then it seems like everybody adopts this notion of evolution, even historians. So in one sense, Henry wants to write about the spirit of society, but he also wants to think of himself as a scientific historian who is trafficking in evolution. In terms of wordplay, also, that last sentence, which ends, "stifle energy as to stimulate evolution," there's an S-E sequence there, which is nice because it rolls off the tongue. And so Henry was also very interested in being something of a stylist. He wrote to one of his former students who was writing a dissertation, and Henry said, "The best that you can be is someone who has a strong literary style, but also has the German manner of seminar scholarship, going to archives, conducting original research, and being professional in every sense." And this is what people to this day still try to do. This is when the public knocks academic historians, the argument is that they've done the research, but the format, it's difficult for them to follow because the language is sometimes impenetrable. It can be jargon laden. So a couple more here. I'm going to read you a quote from The Education of Henry Adams. This is his most famous work. I think that this is perhaps the most famous sequence in the entire book. So it comes from the chapter, The Dynamo and the Virgin. And to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, the dynamo is the industrial process. So the dynamo is Boston. And the Virgin Mary, for Henry, is the medieval period. And so it is the innocence of Quincy, Massachusetts. Henry goes to the Paris Exposition in 1900. He went to lots of expositions. In 1904, he would go to the St. Louis Exposition, and he would become one of the first Americans to ride on a roller coaster. And he really liked that. He enjoyed the roller coaster. So in 1900, he's in Paris, and he walks into the great hall of Dynamos, and he observes the great machines there. And this is what he has to say. As he grew accustomed to the great gallery of machines, he began to feel the 40-foot dynamos as a moral force, much as the early Christians felt the cross. Before the end, one began to pray to it. Inherited instinct taught the natural expression of man before silence and infinite force. That's a heartbreak, that line, silence and infinite force. So what Henry is telling us is that when I walked into this great gallery of machines, I saw this man, and he was standing in front of this machine as his ancestors used to stand before the cross. But we are now, Henry is suggesting, in something of a post-Christian age. The desire to worship things of silent and infinite force, the desire to encounter things that are bigger, more mysterious, more awesome than we are, it's still there. We can't shake that. So Henry might not have been that interested in the transcendentalists, but I would suggest that transcendentalism came upon the same fundamental truth. So, for example, in the 1830s, Ralph Waldo Emerson, his first book, 1836, Nature. And Emerson had given up his pastorship. And I think it was the Second Boston Church. He had moved away from that. But clearly, he craved some type of inspiration, some type of greatness around him. And he found that in nature. And he put that interest in many of his writings from that point on. We know that Henry David Thoreau, in a sense, he did the same thing. When he goes to Walden Pond, when he gets up every morning and he goes into the water, this sort of repetition, this replication of baptism, right? So this becomes his new church. It's something that's larger, it's something greater than himself. What makes what occurs in Paris different is that it's a machine. It's a brute, mute machine. And so what Henry is suggesting to us is that this worship of technology, while it's understandable because we're looking for something to worship that's greater than ourselves, he believes that this is innate. He's not very impressed by what it is because it's a machine. And he has great concern that we think that in some sense, because we make these machines, we master them. But he thought it very likely that these machines would be the end of us. And of course, since he's written that, there have been a whole lot of books, movies, and conversations about just that kind of thing happening. Technology slipping beyond our control, whether it's the accidental nuclear war, whether it's climate change, to the degree that we imperil the futures of our children and our grandchildren. That's become a prominent theme, not in American life, but I think in the thinking of many people around the world. All kinds of movies, and not just science fiction films, that sort of traffic in that theme. So whenever I sort of go outside and I see large numbers of people together, and not really saying too much, but looking on their iPhones, it makes me wonder if that's become sort of in a Henry Adams way. That's the new cross. That's the technology in which we kind of stand before and think we control, but the jury might be out on that. So I've got one more quote here, and this comes from all people, not Henry Adams, but F. Scott Fitzgerald. So F. Scott Fitzgerald, when he was young, he met Henry Adams. Fitzgerald was from St. Paul, spent some of his youth up in Syracuse and Buffalo, and was sent by his parents to a prep school in Hackensack, New Jersey, the Newman School. And at the Newman School, he became friends with Father Sigourney Fay. And Fay was a Catholic convert and lived in Washington, D.C., but would go up to the Newman School and talk with Scott and be something of a mentor. In fact, Fitzgerald's first book, The Side of Paradise, was published when Fitzgerald was very young, just 23, and he dedicated it to Father Fay. And it's a hilarious book in many respects. And Father Fay said to Scott, "Why don't you come to Washington and I'll introduce you to some people that I know down here." And Father Fay knew Henry Adams. Fay was interested in medieval music, philosophy, art, and culture. And particularly late in his life, Henry Adams went hard for these subjects, became a very interested medievalist. It was his way of saying, I side with the Virgin and not the Dynamo. And Father Fay was an intellectual magpie who just floated around all these topics. Somehow he came into contact with Henry Adams. His name comes up in Adams's correspondence. Adams thought that perhaps Father Fay wished to convert him. I'm not sure if Father Fay had dreamt of that or not, but they liked to get together and have conversations. And one day he brought a young F. Scott Fitzgerald over to meet the grand old man. And so in the aforementioned This Side of Paradise, Fitzgerald's first novel, he dropped Henry Adams into it. So here's the place. The Monsignor announced that he had another guest. This turned out to be the Honorable Thornton Hancock of Boston, ex-minister to The Hague, author of an erudite history of the Middle Ages, and the last of a distinguished, patriotic, and brilliant family. So in just one sentence, Fitzgerald, I think, really gets Henry Adams. He references Boston, which of course, even when he went to Washington, Henry Adams could never quite shake. He mentions Fitzgerald that he was the ex-minister to The Hague, knowing in some way, I'm not sure exactly how, that one of the great trials of Henry Adams's life was that even though he wasn't going to run for political office, he would love to have been appointed, maybe to be appointed as an ambassador to the court of St. James's, which his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all been appointed to. But this never happened. So it was a frustration. And for Scott to put in there, ex-minister of The Hague, he seemed to understand that part of Henry Adams. Scott refers to the history of the Middle Ages, which is Henry Adams's Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. And then, of course, he refers to the last of a distinguished, patriotic, and brilliant family. So not literally last, they're still Adamses today. But when we tend to think of this august family, we tend to think of it within 4 generations, bookmarked between John Adams, the second president, and Henry Adams, who sort of stands, in a sense, all by himself because he was not the political Adams. And so I think with Henry, that's what it always sort of comes back to. He could become a tremendous independent writer. He could go to Washington, D.C., but in the end, he really couldn't shake being an Adams. Ultimately, it's what he was. And it was his, in some respects, it was his opportunity. It was his salvation. In other respects, it was his cross to bear, sometimes heavily and sometimes lightly. So that finishes up the formal presentation. Eileen, are there any questions out there?
No, not as of yet. Let me, if anybody has a question, you feel free to chat it in the chat. But in the meantime, I can start us off with a question. Oh, look, we just got one. So we have one, were a lot of people preoccupied by the Dynamo back when Henry Adams was writing about the changes brought on by industrialization, or was he so far ahead of his times back then that he was a lone voice?
Yeah, I think that people were thinking about the dynamo, even if they weren't calling it the dynamo like Henry Adams. We know, for example, that there was a tremendous amount of concern about the course of the American economy. And in the late 19th century, the send-up of finance capitalism and the tremendous growth of the railroad industry and monopolization, I think that's how a lot of people approached it. Political parties formed, the Greenback Party, the Populist Party, in reaction to what was happening in the economy. So I think the way that Henry Adams attaches technology to it, I think that that's something that's probably special to him and maybe a little bit unique. But in regards to how, excuse me, others were thinking about the economy, that was more general. Yeah, so, excuse me, so you can go ahead, Eileen.
Okay. Let you get back your breath there. So I was curious about the education of Henry Adams and why he decided not to publish it widely, and it was only published, after he passed.
So Henry had a habit of doing this. I think it comes from a desire to deny people his work. And the question is, why would you deny people your work? I think that he felt that others had denied him. So he was very self-conscious about the fact that the history books were not selling. He published 9 volumes, and the first one sold about 1,500 copies, and every one after that sold less. I think that bothered him. Also, when he published his 2 novels, he published them anonymously, so as to sort of say hidden in the background. So even before he writes the education, there's kind of a history here, a publishing history of not putting his name out there, not putting his work out there. And I think it's almost a churlish way of denying a public that he thought was denying him of the pleasure of reading his work.
Wow. It seems kind of a little bit immature-ish, would you say? Or
Well, there was that side of Henry Adams. He could be a bit of a curmudgeon. He was a very proud man. And I think that there was some quiet humiliation in what he was experiencing as a writer, as an author.
Interesting. So I was curious, it looks like that John Quincy died when he was about 10 years old. I wonder if, John Quincy, if had any writings about him or he had any memories of his grandfather in that way, or was he a little too young? Just curious.
Yeah, so there's a famous passage in the education of Henry Adams where Henry's being a little 8-year-old, and he doesn't want to go to school. And so his mother's trying to get him to go to school, and he won't go. He's whining, he's complaining. And so he writes about how John Quincy Adams, the president, which is how he and his brothers and sisters referred to their grandfather, got up, took him by the hand, and walked him through a hot morning, about a mile or so, this old man, to school. Put him in his seat, didn't say a word the whole trip, and set him down and walked away. And for Henry, this was the importance of education. This was the importance of doing what you were told to do. And so for Adams, this was a lasting memory. There's some documentation in John Quincy Adams's papers with Henry in it. I mean, not much, but there is some. And the day that Henry was born, and John Quincy Adams learned of this, he wrote immediately to his son and congratulated him on Henry. Henry was named for an uncle who had just died on his mother's side. So Henry is the fourth child. There's Abigail, there's John Quincy, there's Charles Francis. Their father was also Charles Francis. And so the first three were named after Adamses. So Henry is the first to be named for the other side of the family. That's what gave him the sense of freedom. But he always knew what it meant to be an Adams because of what happened with him and his grandfather on that hot summer day, walking him to school.
So we have another question from the audience. The Adams family abandoned Quincy in the 1880s, crowded out perhaps by people who came to work in the shipyard and the granite industry. Did Henry lose his feeling for Quincy too?
If he did, he never really put that into writing. He would still come back to visit people. And in fact, the last year of his life, he stopped in Quincy on his way up to Beverly Farms, where he and his wife had built a house in the 1880s. And after she had killed herself, he stopped going. And he had been there for 30 years. But the last year of his life, he went there. It's almost like he had a premonition. And he stopped along the way. And he saw people in Quincy. And he was staying, in the house up until the time that his parents passed away. And this would be in the 1880s. So he would still have some recollections, and he would still stop over from time to time. And Quincy would come up in the correspondence with him, and usually his brother Charles Francis, and they would be nostalgic about it.
Any others? I was kind of curious about his relationship with his siblings. I believe I read somewhere that Charles Francis Jr. was in the Civil War. He was actually a soldier. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And wasn't there some controversy about him going in there? And if so, like as a soldier and not as like being a scholar as others had? And I was wondering about if they had any conflict or talk about that.
Yeah, he was an officer. He saw action. It was that time where if one had a famous name, one could get a commission, and so there was some talk about that. I think that Charles Francis probably acquitted himself, though. He did engage in combat. He did lead troops. The war record was, it was solid, if not necessarily distinguished. And it was something that I think sort of stuck with Henry a little bit as well, because Henry was not in the army. He was in London with his father, acting as a secretary. Very important job, trying to ensure that Great Britain did not recognize the Confederacy as a nation state. Charles would fall back upon, I think, the reputation of a Civil War general quite easily, and he would parlay that along with the Adams name into a few years as a railroad executive, and then he would become very much interested in genealogy and regional history, and would write history on a scale, not on Henry's scale, but he would write that. And from time to time, he would reflect upon his experiences in the Civil War. And he wrote a memoir, a pretty good memoir. And those experiences are in that document as well.
And were his novels popular at the time? Like, were they any good, really? I mean, it's hard to think of him as a fiction writer.
Sure. So the first novel is great. It's called Democracy. It came out in 1884, and it is a sly and wry send-up of American politics in the Gilded Age. So before, Mark Twain, comes up with, the Gilded Age, Henry had, the year before sort of beat him to the punch. He just didn't call it his novel, The Gilded Age. He called it Democracy. But he was being ironic, and he was poking fun at this notion of American democracy. The book was a big seller. It was published anonymously because Henry didn't want to make enemies. But it was translated into French. We know that the Prime Minister of Great Britain loved it, probably because it confirmed the view of the British that American politics was just too crazy, chaotic, wild, and democratic. But it was a great success. The second novel, Esther, wasn't a great success. And this was a very personal book for Henry. He was writing about his wife's spirituality, or really lack of spirituality. And it came out not long before she took her life. And this is a very personal book for Henry. It was also a philosophical book. And so one need not know the backstory to read the book and see that there's lots of long speeches, philosophical, discursive, and it did not have the interest among readers that Democracy did. But I think that anyone can pick up Democracy today and can read it and can pretty quickly get into the vibe that he's trying to reach for. And if I'm teaching a class on late 19th century America, I would have no hesitation in assigning it to students. They could easily grasp what's going on there.
It kind of reminds me of that anonymous political book from about 20 years ago. I think it was in the Clinton era or something.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know if that was comparable or not, but it's kind of
no, it's a good point you're making. Yeah. It is. I think it was Joe Klein maybe who wrote that.
Oh, right. Yeah. So here's something a little controversial. I didn't know if he had many enemies. I know he had some views on Jewish people. I didn't know if you wanted to touch upon that or not. That might be a little touchy.
Well, yeah, with Henry Adams, it's very much an appropriate question, unfortunately, because anti-Semitism was a facet of his personality. In fact, in the biography, I have a chapter devoted to it, just because it was so prominent. You've got to deal with that in some way. So Henry Adams's anti-Semitism, you can contextualize that in that you see it among the Brahmin class in general, this concern about being displaced. They see immigration coming in. And it wasn't necessarily all anti-Semitic. There was criticism of Jews, of Mediterraneans. For decades, the Brahmin class had not much love for the Irish Catholics either. And Henry shared all those sort of cultural and class prejudices. Having said that, he in the 1890s, there was a financial, what they called panic back then. Today we'd probably call it a recession or even a depression. It was pretty hard. And Henry fell back upon an economic anti-Semitism, saying that the Jewish people, they are the carriers of industrial capitalism, finance capitalism. They bring modernity with them. And so Henry, who doesn't like the dynamo, who doesn't trust technology or the industrial process, he sort of goes off the rails a bit, and he sort of blames this, and you can see this in his correspondence more so than in the published work on the Jewish people, and it's something that becomes a feature of his general view of Western development and Western society. It begins to recede a bit after the 1890s, but it's always there. Why it was more pronounced in Henry Adams than other people of his class, I suppose that that's probably just something idiosyncratic to the man and his emotional makeup.
Interesting. Anybody else have any other questions for Professor Brown? I don't think we're getting any. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It was very fascinating to hear about this kind of lesser known Adamses here, who has a big tie to Quincy. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so thanks, Eileen. And to those of you who are out there, Daniel, Maureen, and yeah, I see your names. Thanks so much, and take care and good night.